Cynthia Enloe on Feminists Everywhere Stay Active While the Bombs Are Falling. Special thanks to the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program and the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies for making this lecture possible. A very special thanks goes to Professor Albo Garcia-Guevara, Professor Rita Mukherjee, the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Advisory Board, and Brenda Campbell for all her behind-the-scenes work. Professor Enloe is a living legend who probably doesn't need an introduction outlining her achievements. And if I try to do that, I will take up an entire session, so I'm not going to try to do it now. I read her work for the first time when I was an undergrad student in the early 2000s in Bangladesh, 9,000 miles away from here. That just demonstrates the incredible reach and the global impact of her work. Her work has continued to inspire generations of feminist scholars, students, practitioners, and activists around the world. Professor Enloe is currently a research professor in the Department of International Development, Community, and Environment, with affiliations with Women's and Gender Studies and Political Science, all at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. She has written 15 books. Her work has been translated in many languages, and she has appeared on NPR, Al Jazeera, C-SPAN, BBC, and many other news platforms. So why do we need to listen to Professor Enloe and talk about feminism while bombs are falling? Well, I would say one of the main reasons might be many of the bombs are our bombs. Living in the United States means living in the heart of a global empire that disburses billions of dollars of military aid to its selected beneficiaries, while our working class, BIPOC, and other minorities communities continue to struggle to make ends meet. As we are speaking, a massive reproductive genocide is unfolding in Gaza, with direct support from our taxpayers' dollars. According to United Nations, more than 9,000 women have been reportedly killed by Israeli forces in Gaza to date. More than 19,000 women have been injured. 37 mothers are killed every day in Gaza. According to CARE, miscarriages in Gaza has increased around 300%. Against this backdrop, it's vital for us, the Worcester State community members, to ask, how do we practice engaged scholarship and engaged citizenship, one of our core institutional values, to strengthen our commitment to social justice, democratic process, and global awareness? How can we play our part to resist war and the destruction of innocent lives? Feminist thinkers and organizers have a lot to teach us, drawing on their decades of organizing locally and globally. Throughout her entire career, Professor Enloe has demonstrated how war and militarism are violent, masculinized institutions and practices serving the purpose of patriarchal foreign policies. Her work involves highlighting how feminist politics can shed light on the complexities of diverse lives and wartime experiences. Her latest book, 12 Feminist Lessons of War, which was published last year, elaborates on feminist lessons of war that can make us dependable allies of gendered and racialized sufferers of wartime violence. As Professor Enloe says, feminist lessons can equip us to hold abusive governments and abusive people accountable. They can help achieve gender and racial justice in war-torn societies. Professor Enloe will be staying after the talk for a book signing event. You can purchase her latest book, 12 Feminist Lessons of War, and get it signed here at the Blue Lounge. So if you're interested, please stay. We will have the book launching event starting at 1:40. We will also be having a small group discussion with Professor Enloe from 2 to 2:45. So please feel free to stay after the event. We are recording the event, so if you are not interested in getting recorded, please feel free to move aside to one of the corners of the room so that you don't get captured. We will be conducting Q&A session at the end, and we will be distributing notepads to all of you. We just want to make sure that we are being inclusive and more efficient. So if you have a question, please write your question on the piece of paper we give to you, and then one of us will collect the question, and then we will conduct the Q&A session. And before we begin the lecture, I am required by the Worcester State Administration to read a statement. And Professor Enloe, our Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, or the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Advisory Board did not write the statement, so please excuse the masculinist and militaristic language. Welcome to Worcester State University. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Please silence your phones. Video or audio recording is not permitted. Individuals observed video or audio recording this session may be asked to leave. The views presented are those of the presenter only, and no endorsement by the university is implied. We will uphold the Worcester State University values of civility and inclusion throughout the program, and disruptions will not be tolerated. The Q&A session will be facilitated by the moderator at the discretion, and microphones will be used. Thank you, everyone. Professor Enloe, the floor is all yours.
So are we all being very polite now? I was worried about your loudness, so I'm very reassured. It's great to be here again. Where's Chris? Chris Waters? Chris, my longtime friend, and Lee Watt, right next to her. My longtime friends, Lee Watt, teaching here at Worcester State. Chris, having taught here at Worcester State for many years. And we were trying to think when was the last time I was actually not only here on campus, but in this room, right? And we figured out it was during the U.S. war in Iraq, and it was a Saturday. It feels like it was a weekend. It wasn't I don't know, I think it was not a class day. And I think, Chris, you had helped organize it. And what it was a mother and a father, that's how they identified themselves, of a U.S. male veteran who had just hung himself in their home garage. That was their son. And they were, of course, in deep grief, but they acted out their grief by trying to tell people around the state what was the lack of mental health care for American veterans that led to the tragedy for their son. And that was here in this room. And I can picture them here in front, trying to talk to people here at Worcester State. So I'm delighted to be here. It's a great privilege to be here at Worcester State. You are very lucky. I had lunch with a bunch of your wonderful faculty members. And for those of you who are students who I saw signing in, you are so lucky. You have great faculty, right? So I'm very lucky to be here with all of you. When Nafisa, and so Nafisa Tanjin, Professor Tanjin, is my host today, and special thanks to Nafisa for organizing. No event just happens, right? No event just happens. Always try to figure out who put the work in, who had the idea to create us coming together. And it was Nafisa Tanjin who did it today. When we were trying to think what might be of interest to all of you and what might spark our own conversation together, I thought that perhaps one of the things that might be really interesting for everybody to think about together is why we're hearing so little in the several war zones. Think Sudan, think Ukraine, think Congo, think Myanmar, Israel, Gaza, think still Syria, think still Ethiopia. I know it's hard to think about more than one war zone at a time, but as citizens of this world, we have to get up to speed. And speed, in this case, means being able to think about more than one tragedy at a time, because we're complicit in virtually all of them. So I was trying to think, why is it we hear so little from local feminists? There are war zones in multiple places. There are feminists in every single one of them. There are Ethiopian feminists. There are Congolese feminists. There are Myanmar feminists that don't get interviewed, that don't get profiled, whose works we have a hard time finding, and therefore probably don't read in our classes, even when we have very good faculty members who try to find the best things for you to read. Why? And what are we missing? So that's what I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about, because for me, it's always such a revelation. So let me talk about a couple of feminists that I've been lucky enough to work with. We'll start with Marta Chumalo. Marta Chumalo. Marta is a Ukrainian feminist, and she's in a community of Ukrainian feminists. Now, what does it mean to be Ukrainian feminist? This is what I've learned from Marta, and by the way, one of the reasons this event, whose title we've already forgotten, but one of the reasons that you always have to think about titles, right? Titles matter, and if you get them wrong, it's really wrong. But the title of this talk was Feminists Think and Act While the Bombs Are Falling. And that is taken directly from the Ukrainian feminist summer school that was organized by Ukrainian feminists in exile in Germany 3 years ago. And they called their summer school Feminist Thinking While the Bombs Are Falling. And it's really hard. I'm trying to think about this. When you are in the midst of violence, when you feel unsafe every hour of the day, when you are caring for people that you feel that you can barely care for, and then somebody suggests that you think feminist thoughts, it feels impossible. But what these Ukrainian feminists were arguing, and they invited me to take part, but I was mainly a listener. What they argued is precisely when the bombs are falling, precisely when you feel as though there's nothing you can do but to try to survive, precisely when you're trying to protect your kids or the elders in your family, precisely then is when you need to think feminist thoughts. So, lesson number one that I learned from Ukrainian feminists. They held this summer school, by the way, the first summer after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what they said was, it's precisely because we are at war. It's precisely because we feel endangered as Ukrainians. That is when we have to think feminist thoughts. And what does that mean? And what did they say that meant? The first thing, as they said, is why pay attention to Ukrainian women's history? Where were we? The Putin regimes, and I use regime very particularly, and if you want to in the question time, you can ask when do I use regime and when do I use government, right? The Putin regime's invasion of Ukraine happened at a very particular moment in Ukrainian women's history. Every war, including the wars you think you're in favor of, and the wars you're horrified by, happen at particular in the history of women's relationship to each other, women's relationships to men, women's relationships to governments. Those things are changing, right? Not always in the most liberating directions. But the war in Ukraine, launched by the Putin-led Russian government, these Ukrainian feminists said to each other, as they were educating each other, happened at a moment when Ukrainian feminism was becoming much more vibrant, much more organized, much more vital. This would be in February 2022. So February 2022 is 30 years. I don't expect you to know Ukrainian history. I didn't know Ukrainian history. 2022, when the Putin major forces came over the border with their tanks and their heavy artillery, was 30 years after Ukrainian declaration of independence from Russian colonialism. That matters. It's not 100 years after independence. It's not 10 years after independence. It is 30 years. That's essentially a generation. That's when this war started. 30 years after the independent women's movement of Ukraine became organized. Women in Ukraine, over those 30 years, have pushed for several things. One, they've pushed for more recognition. All of you who study colonial history will recognize this. They pushed for the recognition of the value of Ukrainian culture, including Ukrainian literature, which oftentimes is mislabeled as Russian, because sometimes it's written in Russian, but it's Ukrainian. They pushed for the respect for Ukrainian folk culture, folk music, folk art, folk theater, that Ukrainian folk art is real art. Now, those of you who have studied women's movements in other post-colonial countries or countries under colonialism trying to liberate themselves from colonial rule will recognize this. Here's an example. In so now you don't have to go back. In 1920, Vietnamese were under whose rule? Well done. See, this is Worcester State. You guys are so smart. It was under French colonial rule. And Vietnamese women, this is what anti-colonialism looks like when you take women's activism seriously. Vietnamese women in the 1920s decided to publish a Vietnamese cookbook as a political act. Why? Because in Vietnam in the 1920s, serious cooking, real cuisine, was considered either French or Chinese. That is, you had to cook the cuisine of your colonial rulers, either the Chinese or, in the 1920s, the French. So to publish, for women, Vietnamese women, to decide to publish a Vietnamese cookbook was considered an anti-colonial act because it was a statement that Vietnamese local culture has value. Vietnamese local culture isn't just the backwater. Vietnamese local culture has its own integrity. It's not just a poor version of the colonial culture. take women's efforts seriously. And this is what the Ukrainian feminists were doing in the 1990s, early 2000s. They were saying that Ukrainian folk art, Ukrainian cooking, is not second class. It is not a poor version of Russian haute cuisine. It is not a poor version of Russian high culture. Ukrainian, because this is what it feels like to be colonized. I think one of the things that I've had to learn about the Ukrainian war is that it's an anti-colonial war. It is not simply, as seen by Ukrainians, it is not simply a war about joining NATO or not. It is not simply a war about joining the European Union or not. It is a war about, they would say, these Ukrainian feminists joining with other Ukrainian activists. They would say it's a war about shedding or throwing off generations of Russian colonial imperial rule. We here in the United States don't know anything, most of us, about Russian imperialism. If we do study imperialism, we study other countries' imperialism, and rightly, but not to exclude what it feels like to be Polish, or what it feels like to be Slovakian, or what it feels like to be Czech, or what it feels like, in this case, to be Ukrainian or Belarusian, which feels like being under colonial rule, but not a colonial rule that most of the rest of the world is at all curious about. So that's the first thing I learned by paying attention to Ukrainian feminists. I began to be curious about a kind of colonialism I had never paid a lot of attention to. I paid attention to Russian politics, to Soviet politics, to Tsarist politics, to now post-Soviet Russian politics. But did I ever use the lens, the feminist lens, of anti-colonialism to understand Eastern Europe? No. And Ukrainian feminists said, you've got to understand that we are anti-colonial feminists. Secondly, and this comes back to my colleague, well, I shouldn't call her a colleague because that's presumptuous. My tutor, Marta Chumilo. So Marta Chumilo is being a feminist in the midst of the war. And here's what she does. She is the leader of, but she would never say she is the main actor in, because she's a feminist, right? You don't go for the star power if you're a feminist. Other people try to make you a star because that's the only way media know how to cover anything, right? But if most feminists would say, you know, interview all my colleagues. So Marta is one of the leading figures in a Ukrainian women's group called Women's Perspectives. And they have a website that's in English because you have to put everything in English if you want the world to know. This is the imperialism of the English language, right? So you can look up Women's Perspectives. It's in the city of Lviv, which if you're at all conscious of what's going on in the war, the Russian-led war in Ukraine, you're aware that Ukraine is a very big country territorially. And the parts that are under the most daily bombing are in eastern Ukraine. The parts that are under enormous stress and occasional bombing are in western Ukraine. And that's where Lviv is, a beautiful historic city with one of the most famous synagogues in Eastern Europe, by the way. And she heads a group called Women's Perspectives. Now, what Marta and her colleagues do by military aggression. And you, as a feminist, are saying, yeah, but pay attention to violence amongst Ukrainians. How welcome do you think that message is? Not very. One of the hardest things to do in a war zone is to be a feminist working against local male-on-female violence. But that's what Marta does. And what she argues is that the local police, which are now understaffed because so much personnel are being drafted into the military, and the courts, which are also understaffed because so many people in the court system are also going to do more work. She is trying with women's perspectives and her colleagues to say you cannot stop being interested in the rights of Ukrainian women who are living with a violent partner. And what she says is that it is very hard to be taken seriously. In fact, what she's told is not now, later. And one of the things I began thinking about, because I began hearing this from other feminists in other war zones, that they are told, not now, later. And I began thinking, you know, later is a patriarchal time zone. Later is a patriarchal time zone. Why? Because the people who tell you later are depending on later never come. And in the meantime, while you're waiting for later, in fact, the roots of inequality, the roots of violence, the roots of injustice are going down deeper. So that if you ever do get to later, after the war, when it's normal, after the economy is rebuilt, after we're safe, after we're stable. See how long later becomes? By then, in fact, the structures and the mindsets that are causing violence against women, that are shrinking women's reproductive rights, that are making it hard to get equal pay, have gone down so deep that it's hard to even imagine reversing it. That's Marta Chumilov. Think about not only yourself, but persuading others who do not want to hear you that violence against women, and domestic violence in particular, is worth talking about and acting in resistance to while the bombs are falling. A second group that I've been educated by, I'm tutored by people all the time. This is the good news. You never stop being a student. That's also the good news. Tuition isn't quite as high. That's good. A second group that has continued to tutor me is a group of Jewish and Palestinian feminists who work together in Israel, and they are called, they also have websites and reports in English. They call themselves Gun-Free Kitchen Table. Gun-Free Kitchen Table. And they started organizing against the proliferation of guns in private hands throughout Israel, in both the Palestinian community in Israel and in the Jewish community. And the Jewish community itself, of course, is very diverse, especially in relations between the Ashkenazi Eastern European heritage Israeli Jews and the Middle Eastern Jews from Libya and Syria and Iraq and throughout the Middle East. So the Jewish Israelis are very, very ethnically divided. And they work between with Palestinian Israelis, of which I think some of you know this figure. I think of all Israelis in Israel, in the formal state of Israel, of all Israelis, I believe 15% are Palestinians. 20. It's 20 now. It's 20. That just shows how much I am. Yes, 20%. And what does Gun-Free Kitchen Table try to do in the midst of war? Their brand new annual report just came out. It's called the Annual Report of 2023, but that's them standing now, looking back the last year. And you can read that and see what they try to do. But what they are trying to do as feminist work is to show all sorts of Israelis how dangerous it is for women for guns to be so widely proliferating in Israeli society. And secondly, what they're arguing is that the Israeli government, that is ministers and civil servants in those ministries and members of parliament who go in and out of the cabinet, to the extent to which they have encouraged the loosening of licensing, does this all sound very familiar? For the acquisition of privately held guns. And they've done it, watch, this is a page right out of the NRA's playbook. They've done it by arguing that it's women's equality that is furthered by encouraging more women to own private guns, that it will increase their security. That's right out of, go down the Connecticut River, where that's the early gun manufacturing industry region of the United States, is the Connecticut River. Go right down the Connecticut River and watch those gun company executives doing exactly the same thing, to encourage the gun ownership amongst women as a move towards women's increased security. Against whom? And what Gun-Free Kitchen Table activists have been doing is saying that proliferation of guns always endangers women and also undermines the security of most men. Now it's interesting how they began Gun-Free Kitchen Table. And they began, by the way, they began as 4 women. That's how things start. Right? 4 women. And what they began to notice, it's about noticing. That's how you get organized. That's how you get mobilized. You notice and then you say, huh. And that huh is the start of feminist thinking. Because you say, what's going on here? That's how you become feminist. What's going on here? And here's what they noticed in the news coverage. This is about, gosh, they're about a group of, that started about 10 years ago. What they began to notice was that there was the killing of women as the partners of men in households where the male partner had a job as a private security guard. And that those private security guards / husbands would bring home their guns from work. who's worked here in Worcester at Daybreak? Oh, gosh. Yes, right, there's at least several. Daybreak is now, how many years? Must be 50, 40 years, 50 is Daybreak. Daybreak is the oldest women's shelter in Worcester, right? It's a wonderful place to do an internship. It's great. And anybody who has studied domestic violence knows that there's a much greater chance that a abusive male partner will actually kill his woman partner if he has a gun. You can do all kinds of terrible, violent damage without a gun. But with a gun, it's much more likely that you will kill the person that you direct your violence towards. That's one of the great lessons of doing a gender analysis of guns and domestic violence. And what these four women began when they did, they wondered, why are these male employees being allowed to bring home their employment weapon? Because they then, and once you do, once you say, I wonder, you're on the road. Because the first thing you have to do is you have to be curious. You cannot be a feminist and not be curious. And so what they did with their curiosity, the first thing they did was, well, is it legal in Israel, under Israeli law, is it legal for a person who's working as a security guard to bring home, usually his, gun? And it turns out it's not legal. The Knesset, which is the name of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset had passed a law that security companies, which as in the United States are very big business. Do you have a security force here on campus that isn't just the campus police? Do you have a contract? Yes, indeed. There we go. Security companies are overwhelmingly privatized, and they are big business. Well, under Israeli law, security companies are supposed to prohibit their employees from being allowed to take their guns home. But who wants to be bothered with that? And so security companies had not been enforcing that law. They had not been abiding by the law. The second thing that these four women who went, they looked more closely at the intersectional dynamics going on here. Because they're very smart feminists in Israel, so they always ask which women are married to which men who are vulnerable to this gun carrying that is illegal. And it is Sephardic Jews. It is Jews whose families came from the Middle East. Most security guards, it turns out, in Israel, hired by these private companies, are hired from the Israeli Jews who come from the Middle East. That is lower class in Israeli hierarchies of ethnicity and background. So it wasn't just any women who were being killed by their male partners who brought home a gun. It was especially Sephardic women who were being killed. So they began digging. They began talking to the news media. They began getting MPs, members of parliament, to introduce questions on the floor of the Knesset about why this law wasn't being enforced. But what they began to do is keep thinking. That's what happens, as you know, if you're taking intro to women's studies. Once you open the box, you can't stop asking the questions. And they began to think, well, how is this proliferation of guns connected to the widespread proliferation of guns in Israeli society? Because as my friend Rayla Mazzali, who's one of the founders of Gun Free Kitchen Table, said, the current war that we are all just noticing, not all, because a lot of you have been following, so this is, a multi-generational ongoing war. And what does the proliferation of guns in private hands that are not scrutinized by the government, that allows for their distribution, what is that doing to the militarization of relations between Palestinians and Jews in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in Israel proper? Now, how do you try to get people in the middle of this war now to take seriously gun proliferation in private hands? Think about what it's like to be a feminist trying to make people pay attention to something that is new to them, that they don't want to think about, and that you are determined to get them to think about. And if you look at this report, one of the things you will see is that they've gotten doctors to think about it. They've gotten healthcare people to think about it. That is, they have broadened their network of alliances, including Palestinian local feminists who are concerned about the rise of crime gangs within the Palestinian community, which are overwhelmingly there. Always ask intersectionally, always ask over time, and always ask why other people don't want to hear you. But be curious about why they resist hearing you, whether you're in Ukraine or Israel or Worcester. The third group, and I'll end on this, the third group that I've been trying to pay attention to is a group in Sudan. And I'm going to say this phrase because they have just put it out. Again, you can find it in English on, you can find this in English on the web. Everybody does want us to pay attention to them. And if we do, we become smarter. So now think about this phrase. The Sudanese, that's Sudan, so Sudan, E-S-E, the Sudanese feminist reading list. The Sudanese feminist reading list. I don't know if many of you have thought about Sudanese feminists, but to think that they have a reading list. And the reading list has just been created, has just been put up on the web, is saying several things. The first thing is that Sudanese feminists think. Sudanese feminists do studies. Sudanese feminists want to make sure that we realize they think. They aren't just there for us to try to bring peace to. They are the peace builders. But to be a peace builder means you have to be a thinker. What does it take to end the militarized violence that has included sexual violence by men against women in Sudan? What does it look like? How do you end it? And when you try to end it, because Sudanese feminists were right at the center of the overthrow of the recent dictator, how do you then try to marginalize women so they have nothing to do with the new government? Sudanese feminist reading list. Doesn't it make you think, so what is the Congolese feminist reading list? What is the Belarusian feminist reading list? That is that every place that we are in involved in, one way or the other, and that we need to understand and take responsibility for, they have thought. They have thoughts that are much deeper and smarter than ours, and they write, and that we can learn from them. So feminists think under bombs. People in their countries try not to listen to them. Why? We don't pay any attention to them. Why? They don't get interviewed by the BBC, they don't get interviewed by Reuters, they don't get interviewed by Le Monde, they don't get interviewed by the New York Times or the Washington Post. Why? Thanks. Nafisa, you want to see? Oh, here, right here. Share.
So we will be doing the Q&A session now. Thank you so much for writing up your questions, giving it to the professors, and thank you so much, Professor Martin Fromm, for moderating the Q&A session.
Oh, nice. Thanks, Martin.
Yes. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. So yeah, we have a number of really excellent questions. And
If you
so,
still think of any while the questions are being asked, you can figure write them down.
okay, I think we're ready. But I think so. I think we're okay.
It takes a village.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They have not rehearsed.
Okay, so I will start with a couple of questions that are more kind of historical, geographical. So,
Use the mic.
oh, Mike's sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good. You're fine.
Hear me now? Okay. So, first of all, kind of two questions. Is the Russian 2022 invasion of Ukraine similar to the Prague Spring invasion of
Here's the
19
historian. Did you write that?
in terms of feminism and victim involvement? Is the Russian regime weaponizing sexuality? And the other question, I'm going to put them kind of lump them together. Would you
Are
feel
all
comfortable
remembering this
commenting
so you can coach
on the
me?
role of sexualized violence and gender militarism in Azerbaijan and Turkey in the genocidal destruction of Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians?
Yes. Let's start with, whoops, am I on? No. Is that better? No, that's nothing.
You only have one live mic.
Don't you love low tech? Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Let's start with Russia, but you're gonna have to remind me of the various parts. Is this, because is this the same, or is this like, not the same, is this like the 1990s, what are we talking about? Prague Spring would be
1964.
1960.
Yeah.
See, now we can have an argument amongst your faculty about dates. In the 1960s, which was then the Soviet Union, that suppressed a local effort by the people of what was then called Czechoslovakia, which is now two countries, the Slovakia and the Czech Republic. They broke up without a war, by the way, broke into two countries. Is this the same as Russia's, the Putin regime's, putting down the Ukrainians? I think not. And I think, in both cases, it was a militarized effort by the authorities in Moscow to put down a dissenting movement in a neighboring country they thought they controlled. That is the same. What is different is that Ukraine, like the Czech Republic now, like Slovakia now, like Poland now, like Belarus now, does matter where you are in history. All of those countries have declared their sovereign independence. In the Cold War, Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe governments were quite structurally under what we sometimes call the Kremlin, but is really the Soviet states' senior elite. That's not true since 1991. That the people that the Russian government now is trying to suppress militarily think of themselves and have the structures and the resources for full sovereign independence. So it's not putting down just a movement. It's not simply calling for, in the Czech case, in the Prague Spring, more democracy. It is feeling, that is the Russian senior leadership, feeling threatened by having actually a democratic society on its borders. Also, the Czech people, the Czechoslovakian people, during the Prague Spring didn't have their own military. They were subsumed under what was called the Warsaw Pact, which was a very unequal alliance, which meant that all of the surrounding Eastern European countries' military forces were under the command of the Russian forces. That's not true. So, in some ways, there is a direct threat of feeling, now let's talk about, I try never to say Russians when I mean very particular people in power. It really leads to racism. I think one has to be very careful about saying Israel does this, or Russia does this, or even the United States does that, or the UK does that. Because, and this is, I'm trained as a political scientist, amongst other things, but I'm also very wary of the broad brushstroke. It puts responsibility not where it belongs. So I will say, I think what is the through line between the 1960s senior Russian state elite's response and the 2022 response by now a new generation, even though Putin was a young intelligence officer in St. Petersburg at the time. But the through line is a Russian state elite incapacity to live with sovereign equals. That seems to be, and of course they're not the only senior elite in the world who think like this, but that seems to be one of the common threads that this current Putin government and the past Soviet governments seem to share. That incapacity to imagine that your own security is not undermined by having sovereign equals as neighbors, I think. So, well, now that's just one question. What are we going to do? This is hopeless. Let's do the Armenian one.
Right. The other question was commenting on the role of sexualized violence and gendered militarism in Azerbaijan and Turkey in the genocidal destruction
Yes.
of Nagorno-Karabakh.
We're very, very lucky here in Worcester because we have a large Armenian community. The largest Armenian community in the greater Boston area is in Watertown. And Watertown, Mass. is the place where they're probably the largest Armenian institutions, which is something to keep in mind if you're ever interested in studying Armenia. But here in Worcester, we have at Clark University, just down the road here, we have the Holocaust and Genocide Studies place, which is, by the way, a place where you can go and study for your PhD on any aspect of Holocaust or Holocaust or genocide studies. And included in the Clark program are students who come there to do research on gender in the Armenian genocide. And we now have some of the most remarkable testimonial-based studies of how women experienced the then Ottoman Empire at its latest date, effort to wipe out the Armenians in Turkey. They were a large but minority in the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And we now have studies of surviving women's memoirs, their witness statements, their biographies and autobiographies, and it's now right down the road in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Library at Clark. So one of the new things, because of the rise of gender studies throughout universities, there are new studies of old violence. And they are being done by third and fourth generation scholars who wonder, well, what did my great-grandmother experience? How come we never talked about it at home? What would happen if I did my dissertation or my thesis asking that question? So we are now beginning to learn, and I was very lucky to be on one of the PhD students' dissertation committees, which means I got to read her research early. I'm very greedy, so that was great. And I just, my eyes were wide open as to the choices that women who were being forced march, Armenian women who were being forced march by militias and military units of the Ottoman Empire, being forced march across deserts, many of whom died at that time. Her study of this, and it just opened my eyes. The gendering of a genocide. It's really, really important. So, great question.
So another question that relates to the topic we were discussing. Do you believe that language that dehumanizes Palestinians and other oppressed groups comes from government, media, or culture, or is it a mix?
I guess the first thing I would, okay, so now you're a feminist detective. And you hear that question, and what do? You go, huh, right? Because what you do is you say, where, when. What was it like in Jim Crow, Alabama? What was it like in California when Japanese Americans were being interned in 1942? Where and when? And then ask that question. Words, don't think. We get down in the grit, right? Even below the weeds, right? Get down, get the dirt under your fingernails, so to speak, and ask that question. And so, for instance, if you think about the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942, a war crime, by the way, right? In the name of fighting the Japanese imperial government and the German, but particularly the Japanese imperial government in World War II. Ask, where did the demonization of Japanese Americans, who were the main small farmers of California in the 1930s and early 40s, you wanted a fresh blueberry or cherry or peach or lettuce or broccoli in 1939 California, you got it from a Japanese farm market person. And you didn't think a thing of it. How did you, who bought the fresh broccoli from a Japanese American truck farmer in 1939, how did you get to the point that by 1942 you thought it was a good thing that that truck farmer and his family were shipped to the desert and put in a detention center? How did you get to that point? How did I get to that point? And that, to do your sleuthing, you do have to ask which government officials sent out which legitimizing messages, which media would not buy onto it. What did the San Francisco Chronicle's editorial page do with this? Did the Chronicle's reporters go along with the editorial board? If you're interested in any print newspaper, even if you're reading it online, don't ever assume that the journalists buy the... Chris is nodding her head because her family owned a newspaper, and she knows exactly how this works. Don't ever assume that the journalist follows the editorial page interpretation. For instance, you could read the Wall Street Journal and read just their journalistic news coverage and be really surprised when you turned around and started reading the editorial page. They are written by different people with different agendas. Here's another little pitch. And that is, I can't remember when I first learned this, but it was such a revelation. Do you know that the headlines given to an article in a newspaper are written by the editors, not by the reporters? I bet you know this because you're smart. But it means read an article in the Worcester Telegram or in the Boston Globe. Read an article and then look at the headline and wonder, what does the journalist think of the headline given to his or her article? Are they happy with it? Are they outraged because something was taken out of their report and made the headline, but that wasn't what they thought was the point of their reporting? So, to answer this question, meaning how to be a feminist detective, pick a time, pick a place, and then start digging at all the sources of potential messaging and watch it over time.
I would love to hear your thoughts on these movements in the context of trans liberation.
Yes, the effort on the part of social movements, particularly social movements in, you have to pick your country again. It does matter if you're looking at Uganda, where homophobia is now written into state law. It is very dangerous to be a trans or lesbian or gay male or non-binary person in Uganda. And you learn this as soon as you get off a plane at the Ugandan Kampala airport. So pick your place, pick your time, and then ask, to what extent have the feminists in that country been working to loosen, to unbind the notions of gender restrictions, and how long have they been doing it? Li Hua and Chris and I can remember when the first studies of tomboys came out. And this would have been in the 1970s, because tomboys, of which I was definitely one, my mother was great. When I see photographs of myself when I was 12, I was not looking like a proper girl, right? And my mother, who was, well, she wasn't that conventional, was she? But in my stupid eyes, I thought she was a conventional housewife. She never told me, the only thing she ever told me is, Cynthia, take your hands out of your pockets. That was the only kind of feminizing prescription. But she never told me I couldn't wear jeans after school. Anyway, it made me think the first studies of what Americans call tomboys were studies done by feminists in women's studies to say that the notion of the gendering of girlhood by the girls themselves, but also by their fathers, by their uncles, by their big brothers, by their mothers, by their aunts, by their grandparents, and they all act differently, that itself was breaking open the prisons of gender binaries. So I guess one of the things that I'm so struck by now is that the efforts at trans rights isn't that new. That it really comes out of the earliest feminism, which said gender itself is imprisoning if it restricts either boys or men or girls or women to something that is straitjacketing. And that the effort today to try and limit those gendered possibilities, and that they're most embedded in a state now with the state of Hungary, right? Under Viktor Orban, which is why the American right wing has gone to Budapest to cheer themselves on, because they think Viktor Orban's government is the government they dream of. That kind of fear, that kind of fear-mongering is something that has been challenged by feminists, maybe using a different language, since at least the 1890s, but more specifically by the 1970s. It's a long, long road. And fear is always wielded against those who try to open the windows and take off the roof, I think. I'm very interested in fear, but I'm afraid of it also. How are we doing on time? You all have to go to your classes. I mean, don't you have work to do?
Well, I don't know if I can bundle a couple of questions.
Don't you, wait, no, what, okay, how many people think they have to go? See, okay, I think that was the last question.
We have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, oh my God, I have to speak fast.
Okay. So, bundle a few questions. So what can I, as a woman, do to help empower other women and help reduce the gender impacts of wars? How can we stop discrimination of women in the Army being status quo? What can Worcester State students do to support feminists who are under attack in the different war zones? And what is a proper way to educate on the matter without being a subject to violence?
Oh, that's one. Okay. But all of us ask this every day, right? I know this sounds like I'm trying to weasel out of a hard question, but I honestly think being curious. Be curious. Listen to people that you ordinarily don't listen to. I mean, really listen. And then follow up with what you hear. Be curious. Pay attention to, and this means you have to do some digging, not just in mainstream media, not just on Instagram, that you be curious about what women activists already are doing and thinking in countries that you're paying attention to. Be curious.
amazingly powerful talk. We have the latest book of Professor Enloe, 12 Feminist Lessons of War, right here, available for purchase. You can get the book signed by Professor Enloe right now. You can take a selfie with her. So yeah, we can have 15 minutes for the book signing event.